The true foundation of an empire is not only written in blood, but carved into the earth itself. The incredible longevity of early China's greatest dynasties, the Qin and Han, presents us with a fascinating historical puzzle. How did these rulers transform simple stone, dirt, and human labor into instruments of control that lasted for centuries? The answer lies not solely on the battlefield, but in a deliberate and monumental campaign of public works. This was a grand strategy written in roads, walls, and canals. Infrastructure became the physical manifestation of state power, a sophisticated toolkit designed to unify, defend, and economically dominate a vast and diverse territory. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the precise engineering and political calculus that turned raw materials into enduring imperial stability. We will uncover how networks of stone were used to suppress rebellion and how silent canals whispered commands across mountains. What does it truly take to hold a civilization together? For an emperor gazing out from his capital, stability was a tangible, daily necessity. It meant far more than just a quiet countryside or a lack of open revolt. True imperial stability was a delicate, three-legged stool, and if any one leg gave way, the entire realm could collapse. The first leg was political unification, the conscious act of welding dozens of former kingdoms, each with its own customs and loyalties, into a single entity ruled by one central bureaucracy issuing one set of laws. The second leg was economic self-sufficiency, ensuring the heartland could feed its massive population and generate reliable revenue through agriculture and controlled trade, wealth that flowed directly back to the state. The third leg was military security, a dual challenge of projecting power outward to deter nomadic confederations on the steppes, while simultaneously maintaining the ability to rapidly crush any flicker of internal dissent before it could become a wildfire. This precise definition of stability was born from a century of terrifying chaos, the era known as the Warring States period. For generations before the first emperor, China was not one country but seven or more, locked in a brutal, endless cycle of alliance and betrayal, conquest and collapse. Borders shifted with the seasons, farmers became soldiers, and entire populations lived under the constant shadow of conflict. From that crucible of instability emerged a clear imperial imperative, a ruler's ultimate mandate: create a system so robust, so interconnected, and so advantageous to its people that a return to that old chaos would be unthinkable. Infrastructure was not merely a luxury of a peaceful state. It was the primary tool for building that state in the first place. Every road, every wall, every canal was a direct physical response to one of those three pillars of stability. They were the answers written in stone and water to the most pressing questions of empire. How do we govern? How do we grow rich? And how do we stay safe? Yet this grand imperial vision did not appear from thin air. Its blueprint was forged in the fires of competition, tested and refined across the battlefields and borders of the Warring States period. Long before a single emperor declared a unified realm, the rival kingdoms were already pioneering the very tools of statecraft that would one day define an empire. They were engaged in a relentless, centuries-long laboratory of power, where the most successful experiments were not conducted with weapons alone, but with shovels, surveying tools, and vast conscripted labor forces. Each state, from the mountainous Chu in the south to the powerful Wei in the Central Plains, invested heavily in local infrastructure for a simple, brutal reason: immediate survival and local advantage. They built frontier walls to mark and defend their territories, not yet imagining one continuous barrier. They dredged canals to move troops and grain for their own campaigns, not for a national network. These were prototypes proving on a smaller scale the undeniable strategic value of large-scale engineering. The true standout student in this harsh school of state building was the state of Qin, perched on the western frontier. Often viewed by its eastern rivals as semi-barbaric, Qin's leadership possessed a ruthless pragmatism. They understood that lasting power was rooted in economic strength, and for an agrarian society, that meant controlling water. Their masterclass in this principle was the Dujiangyan irrigation system, an awe-inspiring feat of hydraulic engineering begun in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Instead of building a dam that would silt up and flood, Qin engineers devised a brilliant natural solution. They split the Min River into channels, creating a system that automatically diverted floodwaters, irrigated the Chengdu Plain, and left the river's flow navigable. The result was transformative. The once troublesome region became Qin's most fertile breadbasket, a land of abundance that could reliably feed massive armies and a growing population. This project taught Qin a fundamental lesson it would never forget, that taming the environment was the most direct path to wealth and military might. It was a lesson written in water and harvested in grain, one they were now prepared to write across the entire map of China. The stage was set not by a dream of unity, but by the hard-won, practical knowledge of what infrastructure could truly achieve. The laboratory of the Warring States period produced its ultimate graduate, a ruler who saw infrastructure not as a local advantage, but as the very skeleton of a new world. His name was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, and his true legacy was forged not in the decade of conquest that united China, but in the monumental campaign of construction that followed. Military victory had given him the map, but now he needed to rewrite its very geography, to transform a patchwork of defeated kingdoms into a single, cohesive organism. His grand strategy was breathtaking in its simplicity and scale. He would use stone and earth to systematically erase the old political landscape and impose a new, centralized reality. This was unification through engineering. The first pillar of this strategy was mobility, the lifeblood of any centralized state. He ordered the construction of a vast, standardized network of imperial highways, straight roads of rammed earth wide enough for multiple chariots to travel abreast. These were not mere paths for trade, they were military arteries. A rebellion in a distant province could now be met not with a slow, local muster, but with a rapid strike force dispatched directly from the capital, a logistical nightmare for any would-be separatist. The second pillar was defense, but of a very specific kind. He connected and extended the old frontier walls of the northern states, creating the earliest continuous precursor to the Great Wall. This was less a fixed border and more a controlled channel, a way to manage and tax the movement of nomadic groups and to prevent surprise raids that could destabilize the fragile interior. But perhaps his most psychologically potent act was one of deliberate erasure. The third pillar was internal disarmament. He ordered the systematic destruction of the defensive walls and fortifications that had belonged to the rival warring states. Those barriers had once symbolized local sovereignty, places where a regional lord could defy the central court. By having them torn down, the emperor was performing a powerful physical ritual. He was dismantling the very architecture of separatism, literally leveling the stage upon which the old cycles of conflict had been played out. In their place, he imposed a new, uniform geography where the only walls that mattered were the ones he controlled on the frontier, and the only roads all led back to his throne. This was the true meaning of his unification, a realm where distance and local loyalty were engineered into obsolescence. These imperial highways were masterpieces of blunt, functional design. Known as zhidao or straight roads, their name was their entire philosophy. They were engineered not for the comfort of merchants or the leisurely travel of nobles, but for the single, overriding purpose of speed. Imagine a ruler drawing a line on a map from his capital to a distant trouble spot, and then ordering the earth itself to conform to that line. That was the reality of the Zhidao. They cut across the landscape with a ruthless directness, plowing through hills and spanning valleys with elevated causeways, their path determined by military necessity, not the meandering routes of older, organic paths. Standardized to a width that could accommodate columns of soldiers and supply wagons moving in unison, these were roads built for the march of legions. Lined with trees not for beauty, but to provide clear marking in all seasons and shade to prevent the very earth of the road from cracking under the sun, preserving that vital, hard surface. And spaced at intervals along them were relay stations, stocked with fresh horses and couriers, creating a primitive but astonishingly fast information network. An imperial messenger could cover distances that once took weeks in a matter of days. This transformed the psychology of the empire. A rebellion in a far eastern province was no longer a distant problem that could fester and grow. It was now a crisis that the central government would know about within days and could respond to with a professional army within weeks. The straight roads physically shrank the realm, turning vast geographical distances into manageable administrative units. They were the tendons of the imperial body, allowing the will of the central nervous system, the capital, to be felt instantly in the farthest fingertips of the territory. This network made the idea of local secession not just an act of treason, but a logistical absurdity. Yet the emperor's roads, for all their power, could only control the space within the empire. To define the realm itself, to mark where civilization ended and the untamed steppe began, required a different kind of structure altogether. This was the genesis of the Great Wall, not as a single, timeless monument, but as an evolving idea in stone and rammed earth. The first emperor's monumental contribution was one of connection, not invention. He ordered the linking of the disparate frontier walls built by the northern states of Zhao, Yan, and Qin during the Warring States period. Where there had once been a patchwork of regional defenses, he envisioned a continuous line, a unified frontier for a unified China. This early wall was less the imposing stone fortress we picture today and more a massive, extended border fortification, a demarcation line etched across the landscape. Its primary function was control, creating a regulated corridor. It channeled nomadic movement toward fortified gates where trade could be taxed and monitored, and it slowed down raiding parties, giving imperial troops precious time to mobilize. It served as a raised highway for the rapid movement of soldiers along the frontier, and most profoundly, it acted as a psychological barrier, a daily, visible reminder of the divide between the settled, agrarian world and the mobile, pastoral world of the steppe. This concept would reach its absolute zenith over 1,000 years later under the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Wall, the majestic stone and brick structure familiar to the world, represents the idea perfected. It was taller, stronger, and incorporated countless watchtowers and garrison forts, but its core strategic purpose remained an evolution of the Qin vision, to manage a frontier, not to hermetically seal it. The wall functioned as a spine for a vast military ecosystem. Soldiers stationed in its forts could patrol, send smoke or fire signals across incredible distances, and control all movement through its gates. It turned a vague, open border into a defined, regulated space, making the abstract threat of nomadic incursion into a concrete, manageable problem of border security. The monumental scale of these projects, from the Qin rammed earth to the Ming stone, came at a cost that is difficult to comprehend. For generations, the state directed a river of human labor northward, conscripting millions of farmers, soldiers, and prisoners to haul earth, carve stone, and work in brutal conditions. The hardship was immense, a story woven into the very fabric of the wall through folklore and historical record. Yet from the perspective of imperial stability, This outward direction of energy served a critical internal purpose. It provided a massive, state-directed project that employed and mobilized a huge segment of the population, focusing collective effort on an external, unifying objective. In a sense, the wall was as much about building a common Chinese identity against a perceived external other as it was about defense. It gave the central government a permanent, physical project that demanded resources, coordination, and loyalty, potentially reducing the likelihood that those energies would turn inward toward rebellion. The wall was not just a barrier against invaders, it was a tool for consolidating the empire behind it. But walls and roads define the landscape of power on land. To truly bind an empire, the most ambitious rulers learned to rewrite the waterways themselves. South of the Qin heartland lay a vast, humid, and only loosely controlled frontier, the lands of modern-day Guangdong and Guangxi. For the first emperor, this region represented both a threat and an opportunity, a potential rear flank for rebellion and a source of untapped wealth, but it was separated by the formidable Nanling Mountains. An army marching south would be strung out along narrow trails, vulnerable and slow, its supply lines stretched to breaking point. The conquest of this southern frontier demanded not just soldiers, but a radical reimagining of geography. The solution was the Lingqu Canal, a 30-kilometer masterstroke of hydraulic engineering that may be the most strategically brilliant infrastructure project of the ancient world. Its objective was deceptively simple: to connect two river systems that nearly touched but flowed in opposite directions. To the north, the Xiang River flowed into the Yangtze Basin, the central artery of Chinese civilization. To the south, the Lai River flowed into the Pearl River Basin and onward to the South China Sea. The Qin engineers' task was to link them, creating a direct water highway from the imperial core to the distant southern coast. They accomplished this not with a single dramatic cut, but with a clever, low-tech system of winding channels, weirs, and splitter dams that gently guided water from one watershed to the other, allowing boats to traverse the subtle divide. The genius of the link was its immediate military utility. Suddenly, the Qin army could move not as a vulnerable column on land, but as a floating fortress. Troops, siege equipment, and most importantly, a continuous flow of grain supplies could be shipped directly from the fertile central plains down to the front lines. This turned a grueling, uncertain campaign into a manageable logistical operation. The conquest of the Beiyu peoples of the south was, in many ways, won by the steady, reliable current of this canal. Yet its true purpose extended far beyond a single military campaign. Once the fighting subsided, the Lingqu Canal became the primary conduit for imperial consolidation. It enabled the controlled migration of hundreds of thousands of Han Chinese settlers from the overcrowded north into the newly conquered territories. These settlers brought with them northern agricultural techniques, administrative practices, and cultural norms. Just as vital, the canal allowed the riches of the south, exotic goods like pearls, spices, and tropical hardwoods, to flow north to the capital, economically tying the region to the center. What had been a distant, culturally distinct frontier was physically and economically stitched into the fabric of the empire. The water that once divided the land now unified it, carrying not just boats, but the very process of integration. The Lingqu Canal did not just move water, it moved people, goods, and ideas, transforming a potential breakaway region into a connected, productive limb of the imperial body. The first emperor's vision was a blueprint of raw power, but it was the dynasty that followed that learned to build a home upon it. The Han Dynasty, rising from the ashes of Qin's rapid collapse, faced a monumental question. How could they wield the same tools of control without inciting the same explosive backlash? Their answer was one of profound refinement, a shift from revolutionary construction to sophisticated administration. For the Han, infrastructure was not just about imposing order, but about cultivating loyalty. They inherited the Qin skeleton, the straight roads, the frontier walls, the grand canals, and they proceeded not to tear it down, but to weave a more resilient and prosperous society through its very framework. This was the Han synthesis, a 4-century-long project in sustainable stability. Where Qin had used roads primarily for rapid military deployment, the Han saw them as arteries for commerce and communication. They maintained and expanded the Imperial highway network, but they populated it with a regulated system of postal stations, market towns, and government hostels. This transformed the stark military corridors into vibrant social and economic spaces. A merchant traveling from the capital to the distant frontier could now move with relative security, find standardized places to rest and trade, and operate under a predictable set of commercial laws. The road was no longer just a path for soldiers, it was a channel for tax revenue, cultural exchange, and the steady hum of imperial oversight. This administrative layer turned physical control into a more subtle and ultimately more durable form of governance. The state's presence was felt not only in the occasional passing legion, but in the friendly official at the relay station who recorded your journey, in the fair weights and measures at the town market, and in the sense that the empire worked to your benefit. By optimizing the existing networks for daily life, the Han made the centralized state indispensable. They created a system where stability was not just enforced from above, but experienced and valued from below. This focus on economic integration reached its zenith with their mastery of the second great water network, the Grand Canal of the East. While the Qin's Lingqu Canal had conquered the south, the Han and their successors looked to the fertile, rice-producing regions of the lower Yangtze River. The early sections of what would become the Grand Canal were developed to solve a very specific problem. The political and military heart of the empire remained in the drier wheat growing north, around the capital cities, but the economic engine was increasingly in the wet, rice-abundant south. How do you feed a massive northern bureaucracy and army with grain from a distant southern basin? The answer was a water highway on a staggering scale. The Grand Canal created a direct, protected route to move millions of tons of tax grain from the Yangtze Delta to the capitals. This was the life support system of the mature empire. It rendered the north immune to local harvest failures, as shortfalls could be compensated by shipments from the south. More critically, it made the southern elite economically tethered to the northern court. Their wealth and status now depended on their role as suppliers to the imperial system. Any thought of southern secession would mean cutting off their own primary market and source of political influence. The canal did not just move food, it moved dependencies, locking the most productive region of the empire into a relationship of mutual, if unequal, necessity with the center. This was the Han genius, turning infrastructure from a tool of conquest into an instrument of symbiotic control. A network of roads is only as powerful as the information that travels upon it. The Han Dynasty understood this principle at the deepest level. They took the Qin's stark military highways and layered them with an intricate, living system of administration, transforming them from simple pathways of control into the central nervous system of a lasting empire. This was not merely an expansion of the road system, but its evolution into a tool for continuous, daily governance. The Han formalized and greatly extended the network, ensuring that every major provincial capital, every strategic frontier garrison, and every productive agricultural commandery was linked by these standardized imperial highways. But the true innovation lay in what they built along these roads, at precise intervals determined by a day's travel for a loaded cart or a fast horse. The Han established a chain of way stations. These were not just simple rest stops. They were fortified complexes containing guest quarters, storage barns, stables with fresh horses, and administrative offices. This created a reliable, state-controlled infrastructure for movement, where officials, soldiers, and even authorized merchants could find shelter, supplies, and security. The predictability this system introduced cannot be overstated. An inspector dispatched from the capital to audit a distant province could plan his journey with exactitude, knowing where he would sleep each night and that his official documents would be safe. This logistical certainty made the vastness of the empire manageable, shrinking it not in miles, but in the time and risk required to traverse it. The most critical component of this network, however, was the Imperial Courier system. This was the information bloodstream of the Han state. Couriers, operating in relays, could carry urgent dispatches from the farthest frontier to the capital in a matter of days, not weeks. A report of a local flood, the suspicious movements of a regional governor, or news of a minor border incursion would race along these roads, moving from station to station with practiced efficiency. Fresh riders on fresh horses ensured the message never slowed. This created a revolutionary advantage for the central government, the gift of timely intelligence. Rebellion thrives in the shadows of delay and poor communication. By the time a local governor could mobilize his forces and declare his independence under the old, slower systems, the court might not hear of it for a month. But under the Han courier system, the court would know within days. They could immediately dispatch orders to loyal commanders in adjacent provinces, cut off the rebel supply routes using the very same road network, and mobilize a central army, all while the rebellion was still in its fragile early stages. The road became a preemptive weapon against disunity. This physical network empowered the human element of Han control, the traveling inspectors and officials. The Han bureaucracy was vast, but its effectiveness hinged on the ability of the center to verify what was happening in the provinces. Officials known as regional inspectors and their subordinates were the eyes and ears of the emperor. Their job was to tour their assigned territories, auditing local government accounts, reviewing legal cases, observing agricultural conditions, and gauging the morale of the populace. Their power derived directly from the road and way station system. They could travel without relying on the hospitality and potentially the manipulation of the local governors they were meant to oversee. They arrived unexpectedly, their authority backed by the knowledge that their reports would speed back to the capital unimpeded. This system of mobile oversight turned the roads into channels of accountability. A corrupt or incompetent local official could no longer hide in his administrative seat, controlling all information that left his district. The road brought the impartial scrutiny of the central state right to his doorstep. In this way, the infrastructure did more than move troops. It sustained a culture of bureaucratic integrity and central loyalty. The highway was no longer just for responding to crises. It was the permanent pathway through which the empire governed itself, a constant, quiet assertion that the center was always watching, always connected, and always in reach. The Han Dynasty's frontier strategy was a masterpiece of layered statecraft, moving far beyond simple stone barriers. Under ambitious rulers like Emperor Wu, the wall was no longer just a defensive line. It became an instrument of active economic expansion. His most significant move was to push the empire's fortified frontier deep into the Hexi Corridor, a vital strip of land between the northern deserts and the Tibetan plateau. This was not merely about claiming territory, it was about securing a corridor of unimaginable wealth, the embryonic Silk Road. By building walls and watchtowers along this passage, the Han military created a protected highway for merchant caravans. Bandits and raiding parties could be monitored and intercepted from these fortifications, making the long journey from Central Asia to the Chinese heartland a calculated risk rather than a suicidal gamble. This transformed the wall's function from pure defense to revenue protection. Every bolt of silk, every jar of spices, every strange gem that traveled safely under the gaze of Han watchtowers meant customs duties flowing into the imperial treasury and exotic goods gracing the capital. The wall became the guardian of the empire's most lucrative economic artery. Yet stone alone could not bring lasting stability. The Han brilliance lay in combining this physical infrastructure with human systems. While walls secured the route, Emperor Wu dispatched the explorer Zhang Qian on his famous diplomatic missions westward. Zhang Qian's travels were not sightseeing trips, they were strategic intelligence gathering. He sought alliances against common nomadic foes like the Qiongnu Confederation and brought back priceless knowledge of the lands, cultures, and politics far beyond the frontier. This information allowed the Han to practice a form of frontier diplomacy, playing one-step group against another and extending their influence through prestige and trade agreements, not just military force. The wall provided the secure base from which this diplomacy could be projected. The final, crucial layer was the military agricultural colony, or Tuntian system. The Han stationed soldiers along the fortified frontiers with a dual mandate to guard and to farm. These soldier settlers were given land to cultivate, becoming self-sufficient communities that could feed the garrison and even produce a surplus. This solved the ancient, crippling logistical problem of supplying distant armies. No longer did every sack of grain need to be hauled 1,000 miles from the interior, a process that often consumed more food than it delivered. These colonies created permanent, invested Chinese communities on the frontier. They were living extensions of the empire, turning contested borderlands into productive, Han-controlled territory. The children of these settlers grew up on the frontier, their loyalty tied to the land they farmed and the wall that protected it. This multi-pronged strategy of physical walls, active diplomacy, and self-sustaining military settlements created a depth of control the Qin could never have achieved. The Han frontier was not a brittle shell but a complex, adaptive zone of administration. It was a system designed not just to keep threats out, but to steadily project Chinese power, culture, and economic interest outward. For generations, this integrated approach turned the volatile northern border from a constant crisis into a managed, and often profitable, space. The silence of the watchtowers now overlooked not just empty steppe, but the steady flow of caravans and the orderly rows of military farmsteads, a testament to an empire that had learned to build not just walls, but an entire ecosystem of stability. Silk was the ultimate imperial currency, a fabric so light it could be carried on the wind, yet so valuable it could anchor an empire. For the Han Dynasty, the legendary Silk Road was far more than a spontaneous trade route. It was a deliberate, state-engineered infrastructure project, a sprawling network of security and supply carved across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The Han did not simply hope merchants would find a way west. They built the way, transforming a perilous gamble into a controlled pipeline of wealth and influence. This was economic statecraft written in desert sand and mountain passes. The true innovation was not the trade itself, but the invisible lattice of support that made it possible and profitable for the state. The greatest threat to a caravan was not bandits, but the desert itself, the crushing absence of water. Han's strategy targeted this vulnerability with brilliant precision. Military expeditions were dispatched to secure critical oases, those rare pockets of life in the arid wastes. Once controlled, these oases were transformed into fortified garrison towns. Soldiers stationed there did more than just guard, they became civil engineers. They dug and maintained deep wells, ensuring a reliable water supply. They built warehouses to store grain and fodder, creating resupply depots in the void. They even planted small orchards and gardens, micro-agricultural stations to supplement provisions. These oases became way stations of imperial authority, islands of Han control in a vast neutral sea. A merchant traveling from Chang'an to the Pamir Mountains now had a known chain of safe havens, each a day's journey apart, where he could water his animals, repair his carts, and sleep without fear. This logistical backbone turned a speculative journey into a repeatable, and therefore insurable, business venture. The state's investment directly stimulated the private trade it sought to tax. But the Han vision extended beyond mere facilitation. By controlling the oases, they controlled the route itself. They could levy standardized customs duties at each major garrison town, funneling a predictable stream of revenue directly into the imperial treasury. This was foreign trade systematized and monetized as state revenue. More strategically, they could regulate what and who traveled. The flow of goods was carefully managed with high-value, low-bulk items like silk, lacquerware, and bronze mirrors flowing west, while horses, jade, glass, and gold flowed east. This created a favorable balance of trade, but also a powerful cultural exchange. Exotic goods from distant empires became status symbols in the Han court, tangible proof of the dynasty's global reach and sophistication. This imported prestige reinforced the emperor's mandate at home, visually demonstrating that his rule connected China to the wider, wondrous world. The most profound stability, however, came from the political relationships forged along the route. The garrison towns and protected trade created a sphere of influence. Local rulers of Central Asian city-states, whose economies now thrived on the safe passage of Silk Road traffic, became de facto client states of the Han. Their prosperity was tied to the empire's goodwill. They had a vested interest in maintaining order along their segment of the route, suppressing bandits, and often providing auxiliary troops to Han expeditions. This created a buffer zone of cooperative polities between the Han heartland and rival empires like Parthia. External threats were mitigated not just by walls, but by a chain of economically interdependent allies. The Silk Road, therefore, solved multiple stability equations at once. Internally, it generated vast revenue without raising taxes on the peasantry, reducing a classic source of discontent. It created lucrative state monopolies and private fortunes, tying the merchant elite firmly to the imperial system. Externally, it projected power through economic magnetism rather than constant warfare, creating a network of friendly dependencies. The desert wells and mountain garrisons were the physical pins on a grand strategic map, holding in place a system where wealth flowed inward, influence radiated outward, and the empire's security was underwritten by the very prosperity it cultivated. The silent caravans moving through the night were not just carrying silk, they were carrying the subtle, enduring power of a state that had mastered the art of building roads to riches. The true power of an empire is measured not only in the walls it builds against outsiders, but in the storehouses it fills for its own people. While grand walls and sprawling roads projected power, a quieter, more profound network operated in the heart of every county and commandery. This was the nationwide system of state granaries, the logistical bedrock of imperial benevolence and the ultimate safeguard against the most dangerous threat of all, a hungry populace. These unassuming buildings, filled with grain, were perhaps the most politically astute infrastructure of all. Their function was brilliantly dual-purpose. In times of peace, they served as strategic reserves, allowing the emperor to feed his standing armies and massive labor conscription projects without constantly draining the local harvests that farmers relied on to survive. This alone prevented a major source of grievance, but their true genius was revealed in crisis. When the rains failed, when rivers flooded the fields, or when a late frost withered the crops, these granaries became instruments of disaster relief. Local magistrates, following imperial decree, could open the storehouses and distribute grain to starving communities. This act transformed the abstract, distant emperor into a direct provider, a lifeline in a moment of absolute desperation. It physically demonstrated the state's capacity to care for its subjects. This direct link to survival was the practical foundation of the mandate of heaven, the ancient belief that a ruler held power only so long as he governed justly and maintained cosmic order. A famine was not merely a natural disaster, it was a potential sign of heavenly displeasure, a crack in the dynasty's legitimacy. By systematically intervening to alleviate suffering, the state was performing a vital political ritual. It was proving, in the most tangible way possible, that it still possessed the virtue and competence to hold the mandate. Each sack of distributed grain was a rebuttal to chaos, a quiet argument for continued loyalty. This system managed the most fundamental social risk. A desperate farmer with empty bowls might turn to banditry or listen to the whispers of a rebellious local strongman. But a farmer who received emergency rations from the emperor's own storehouse was far more likely to see the central government as his protector. The granary network, therefore, was a preemptive strike against insurrection. It addressed the root cause of unrest before it could ever erupt into violence. This logistical foresight bound the people to the state through a covenant of mutual need. The empire provided security from starvation, and in return, the populace provided their labor, their taxes, and their acceptance of imperial authority. It was a silent, continuous exchange happening in 1,000 county seats, turning the simple act of storing grain into a profound mechanism of control and cohesion. Yet the grandest walls and swiftest roads would mean nothing if the fields themselves lay barren. The true heartbeat of the Han Empire pulsed not in its palaces, but in the rhythmic flow of water through countless irrigation channels. While military projects conquered territory, it was water conservancy that truly cultivated an empire, transforming volatile landscapes into engines of predictable wealth. The Han understood a fundamental truth: controlling water meant controlling the very source of their power, the annual harvest. Their approach was systematic and vast, a nationwide commitment to hydraulic engineering that served one clear goal: to make the land reliably fruitful. They inherited brilliant systems like the Dujiangyan and did not merely maintain them, they perfected their administration. Teams of engineers and conscripted laborers were permanently tasked with dredging silt from its channels and reinforcing its weirs, ensuring that the miracle of the land of abundance never faltered. This was not passive upkeep, but active reverence for an infrastructure that fed armies and filled treasuries. But their ambition reached far beyond inherited projects. The Han faced the empire's greatest hydraulic challenge head-on, the Yellow River, known as China's Sorrow. Its unpredictable floods could wipe out entire provinces, causing catastrophic famines and mass displacement that shattered regional stability. Han emperors launched some of the most massive public works projects in history to tame it. They mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers to build and reinforce thousands of miles of dikes and levees along its course. They excavated diversion canals to siphon off floodwaters into designated spill areas, sacrificing some land to save the greater agricultural plain. This was a colossal, ongoing battle against nature itself, and the state treasury was the primary funder. Why would an emperor pour such immense resources into this endless struggle? Because the mathematics of power were perfectly clear. A well-watered field produced a surplus. A surplus meant a farming family could meet its tax quota, set as a portion of the harvest, and still have enough grain left to feed themselves and sell at market. This created a contented, stable peasantry, the overwhelming majority of the population and the primary tax base of the state. Reliable water control directly translated into reliable revenue. The government could budget and plan, knowing with confidence how much grain would flow into its granaries each autumn. This predictable income funded everything else: the salaries of the vast non-agrarian bureaucracy, the supplies for the standing military, and the coffers for new infrastructure projects. It created a virtuous cycle. Taxes collected from a prosperous agricultural zone were reinvested in maintaining the water systems that kept that zone prosperous. The peasant, seeing the state's canals bring water to his field and the state's dikes protect his home, experienced the empire not as a distant tax collector, but as a direct benefactor. His loyalty was cultivated alongside his crops. In this way, the humble irrigation ditch was as vital to imperial security as any fortress wall. It quieted the most dangerous kind of unrest, the desperation born of empty bellies, and it fueled the entire imperial machine with the steady, rhythmic pulse of agrarian wealth. The empire's stability was quite literally rooted in the mud of its well-maintained waterways. But the stones of the Great Wall and the smooth surface of the imperial highways hold a silent, sobering truth. For every mile of rammed earth and every ton of quarried stone, there was a human price paid in relentless toil. The very systems that knitted the empire together were built upon a foundation of coerced labor, a reality that reveals infrastructure as a profoundly double-edged sword. This was the dark counterpoint to imperial achievement, the immense social strain woven into the fabric of stability. The primary mechanism was the Corvée labor system, a legal obligation that required every able-bodied male commoner to donate a set number of days each year to state projects. In theory, it was a tax paid in sweat instead of grain, a civic duty. In practice, during the peak of monumental construction, it became a crushing burden. A farmer might be conscripted from his fields and sent 1,000 miles away to the northern frontier, ordered to haul earth for the wall under the watchful eyes of military overseers. The work was brutally physical, the rations meager, and the conditions harsh. Projects of such scale demanded not just days, but years of a man's life, pulling him away from his family and his own subsistence, creating a deep well of quiet resentment in villages across the land. This human cost was not an accidental byproduct, it was a calculated budgetary decision. By using conscripted labor, the state could achieve its colossal ambitions without the enormous financial expense of paying a professional workforce. The empire saved its silver and grain, but it spent its social capital. The resentment simmered, a low-grade fever in the body politic. Folk tales and songs from the era, like the haunting legend of Meng Zhongnu, whose husband died building the wall, preserved this collective memory of loss and hardship. They served as a cultural counter-narrative to the official story of glorious achievement, reminding everyone that stability for the empire could mean devastation for the family. Herein lies the tragic paradox. The infrastructure designed to ensure dynastic longevity contained the seeds of its own potential destruction. When conscription drives became too aggressive, or when they coincided with a poor harvest, that simmering resentment could boil over. The very peasants who built the roads could later use those same roads to march in protest, or to flee into the hills as bandits. The granaries that were meant to prevent famine could be emptied by corrupt officials, leaving nothing for relief when the conscripted farmers could not tend their own crops. History shows that excessive demands for corvée labor were a frequent catalyst for popular unrest, a major factor in the rebellions that toppled dynasties, including the Qin itself. The Qin's rapid collapse was not just about its harsh laws, but about the exhaustion of a population pushed beyond its limits by endless, monumental projects. Thus, the story of imperial infrastructure is one of constant, precarious balance. The state had to weigh the strategic need for walls and roads against the social cost of building them. It had to manage not just the geography of its realm, but the morale of its people. A successful dynasty was one that could channel this human energy efficiently, offering periods of rest and reward between demands, making the burden feel like a shared sacrifice for a common good. A failing dynasty was one that saw its people merely as a resource to be consumed. So as we admire the engineering marvels of the past, we must also listen for the echoes within the stone, the whispers of the countless unnamed individuals whose labor was the true mortar of empire. Their story adds a necessary layer of complexity, reminding us that the tools of control were always balanced on the knife's edge of consent. The empire's control was not always written in grand proclamations, but sometimes in the quiet space between two wooden wheels. Among the sweeping reforms of the first emperor, one of the most ingeniously subtle was a simple decree standardizing the axle width of all carts and chariots across the land. On the surface, this seems like a minor bureaucratic detail, a matter of measurements, but its true purpose was nothing short of brilliant, a masterstroke of logistical control that physically locked the entire economy into the state's predetermined tracks. The imperial highways, those wide, straight roads of rammed earth, were not smooth surfaces. Over time, the constant passage of heavy carts and wagons would wear deep parallel ruts into the roadbed. These ruts, while seemingly a sign of wear, actually became a feature. They created guided pathways that reduced friction, making it far easier for animals to pull heavy loads. They were, in effect, the empire's first rails. The Qin decree ensured that every single cart, from a merchant's wagon to a military supply vehicle, had its wheels set at the exact same distance apart. This meant every cart in the realm would fit perfectly into the ruts carved into the imperial roads. Travel on the state network became smooth, fast, and efficient. But venture onto any local, unofficial path, one without these standardized ruts, and your journey instantly became a slow, bumping, arduous struggle. The choice for any traveler or merchant was made for them by simple physics. If you wanted to move goods or people with any speed and ease, you used the emperor's roads. This technical standard became an invisible enforcer of state policy. It centralized all significant economic movement, ensuring that commerce flowed along the routes the state could monitor, tax, and if necessary, intercept. It made the empire's logistical network the only rational choice, weaving the populace into a system of dependency through convenience. A local lord hoping to build his own independent trade network would find his carts hopelessly inefficient on his own territory and perfectly suited only for the roads that led back to the central authority. This was soft power engineered into the very axle of every cart, a quiet mandate that guided the realm as surely as any written law. A standardized axle ensured every cart would fit the imperial roads, but the true power of those roads lay in what they carried faster than any wagon. That power was information, and the Han Dynasty built a system to move it at the speed of a galloping horse. This was the imperial post system, the living nervous system that animated the empire's physical skeleton. Stretching along every major highway at intervals calculated for maximum efficiency stood relay stations. These were not simple inns but fortified nodes of state control, each stocked with fresh horses, dedicated couriers, and secure storage for official documents. A messenger bearing urgent news would ride into the station, his mount exhausted. In moments, he would transfer his sealed dispatches to a fresh rider on a fresh horse, and the message would fly onward, never stopping. This relay principle allowed information to traverse distances of hundreds of miles in a matter of days, a speed that was nothing short of revolutionary for the ancient world. It transformed the empire's sense of time and space, making real-time command a tangible reality. An emperor in the capital could issue an edict in the morning and know it would be read aloud by a magistrate in a distant province within the week. This uniformity was critical. For the first time, a new law or tax policy could be promulgated simultaneously across the realm, creating a shared legal reality that helped to erode old regional differences. It meant a corrupt local official could no longer twist the emperor's words for his own benefit, because an authentic, sealed copy would arrive directly from the center, its contents known to all. But the system's most vital function was intelligence. The roads now carried a constant two-way flow of data. Imperial inspectors and regional governors sent regular reports on harvest yields, local gossip, and the mood of the populace. This river of information flowed back to the capital, where advisors could analyze it for signs of trouble. A minor bandit outbreak, a suspicious gathering of local nobility, or a natural disaster, all were known to the court almost as they happened. This allowed for preemptive governance. Instead of waiting for a full-scale rebellion to erupt before reacting, the state could dispatch a small investigative team, adjust a tax quota, or send emergency grain at the first sign of distress. The post system turned the empire from a sluggish giant into an alert organism, capable of sensing a problem in its fingertips and sending a response before the injury became fatal. In military terms, this was the ultimate force multiplier. A general on the restless northern frontier could send a request for reinforcements or supplies and receive a decision from the emperor in a time frame that mattered. Conversely, the emperor could adjust strategy based on fresh reports from the field, commanding distant armies with an unprecedented level of direct oversight. This near real-time communication made centralized military control not just an ideal but a daily practice. It prevented generals from becoming autonomous warlords, as their every major move could be reported by imperial observers and questioned by the throne. The physical roads, therefore, were merely the veins and arteries. The imperial post system was the blood, carrying the vital oxygen of information that kept the entire body politic alive, coordinated, and under the conscious command of its central mind. Without this ceaseless flow of words, the walls would have been silent sentinels and the roads empty corridors, impressive but ultimately inert. It was the galloping hoofbeats of the couriers that gave the empire its pulse. The courier's message could travel at the speed of a horse, but the grain to feed a frontier army could not. This was the ancient world's most persistent military dilemma, a logistical nightmare that had doomed countless campaigns. For every soldier stationed on the distant, windswept frontier, the empire needed to transport a mountain of grain over 1,000 miles of rough terrain, a process so costly it often consumed more food than it delivered. The Han Dynasty's ingenious solution to this problem did not involve faster carts or better roads, but a fundamental rethinking of the soldier's role itself. They turned their warriors into farmers, creating the military agricultural colony known as the Tuntian system. This was not a temporary camp, but a deliberate, state-planned settlement. Soldiers received plots of land along the frontier walls and in strategic valleys, and their duty was twofold: to stand guard and to plow the earth. They built irrigation channels to water the dry soil, planted crops suited to the harsh climate, and established permanent homesteads. Often, their families would join them, putting down roots in what was once considered no man's land. The effect was transformative. A garrison that had once been a drain on the imperial treasury, requiring a constant, vulnerable supply line from the interior, suddenly became self-sufficient. It could feed itself and, in good years, even produce a surplus to store in local granaries. This solved the core economic equation of frontier defense, turning a pure cost center into a productive, stabilizing asset. But the Tuntian system's true genius was demographic and cultural. These were not temporary occupiers but permanent settlers. As generations passed, the children of these soldier farmers knew no other home. Their loyalty was to the land they cultivated and the imperial system that protected it. They spoke the language of the Central Plains, followed Han customs, and saw themselves as the front line of civilization. This created a living, expanding buffer zone of Sinicized territory. The frontier was no longer just a line on a map defended by reluctant conscripts far from home. It was a belt of thriving Han communities with a direct personal stake in maintaining order. A nomadic raid was no longer an abstract threat to the emperor's authority. It was an attack on their fields, their homes, and their families. This system of rooted defense made the borderlands more resilient and far harder to destabilize. The Tuntian colonies transformed the geography of power, ensuring that the empire's furthest edges were not just held by force, but were actively cultivated, both in soil and in spirit, becoming enduring parts of the Chinese world. A city's plan is a philosophy written in streets and walls. While roads connected the empire and walls defined its edges, the capital city served as the ultimate ideological statement, a perfect model of how the emperor believed the world should be ordered. Chang'an, the magnificent capital of the Western Han Dynasty, was far more than a seat of power or a hub of commerce. It was a meticulously designed machine for governance, its very blueprint an act of control. The city was laid out as a near-perfect rectangle, surrounded by towering earthen walls and divided by broad, straight avenues that ran like ruler lines across the landscape. This rigid grid pattern was the first layer of the message, imposing geometric order upon the organic chaos of human settlement. It declared that here everything had its proper place. The city's layout physically enacted the Confucian social hierarchy. The most sacred and secure sector was in the north, where the immense Huayong Palace complex stood, its halls raised on high platforms. This northern placement was no accident. It mirrored the celestial belief that the pole star, the unmoving center of the heavens, resided in the north. By placing his palace there, the emperor positioned himself as the terrestrial counterpart to that cosmic anchor, the still and stable axis around which the entire world revolved. His authority was literally built into the cardinal directions. From this northern apex, power and surveillance flowed downward. The main avenues, some wide enough for 12 chariots, ran directly from the palace gates to the city's southern and eastern gates. These were not just thoroughfares, they were ceremonial and military corridors. Imperial processions could display their grandeur along them, and troops could deploy swiftly to any district. The grid ensured there were no winding, defensible alleys where dissent could hide. Every block could be observed and accessed by central authority. The city's commercial life was also carefully engineered. Designated marketplaces, like the famous Eastern and Western markets, were placed in specific wards, enclosed by walls and gates that were locked at night. Market officials regulated prices, weights, and the conduct of trade, turning economic activity into a state-supervised spectacle. A merchant's success depended not just on shrewdness, but on operating within the strictly defined physical and bureaucratic box the empire provided. Even residential wards were closed compounds, their gates guarded by state-appointed wardens who monitored comings and goings. This transformed the capital into a panopticon, a city where the feeling of being watched was woven into the urban fabric. The message to every citizen, from the highest minister to the lowest artisan, was unambiguous. You are part of a grand hierarchical design. Your role, your movement, and your prosperity are all functions of your position within the emperor's orderly universe. Chang'an was the idealized imperial state in miniature, a functioning scale model where control was not only enforced by law, but embedded in the very experience of walking its streets. To live in the capital was to inhabit the empire's ultimate vision for itself. The silent power of the capital was sustained by a river of grain flowing from the south. While the northern plains around Chang'an were the political and military heart of the Han Empire, they were not its stomach. The true agricultural powerhouse lay hundreds of miles to the southeast, in the lush, rain-drenched basin of the Yangtze River. Here, farmers could harvest 2 rice crops a year, creating a staggering surplus. This geographical reality presented the Han Dynasty with its most delicate logistical puzzle. How do you feed 1 million people in the capital city and its surrounding garrisons when your breadbasket is a mountain range away? The answer was not found on roads but in water. The Han engineers turned to a network of canals, with one in particular becoming the empire's most vital artery, the Kayok or Grain Transport Canal. This was not a single monumental ditch, but a sophisticated system that linked natural rivers, existing waterways, and newly dug channels into a continuous aquatic highway. It created a protected, all-weather route from the Yangtze Delta directly to the vicinity of Chang'an. The genius of this system was its efficiency. A single barge, poled by a small crew, could carry the grain equivalent of hundreds of carts pulled by thousands of oxen. It moved with the steady, relentless current of connected rivers, bypassing the slow, costly overland journey through mountain passes. This solved the fundamental economic equation of imperial survival. Every autumn, as the rice was harvested in the south, a portion was collected as the land tax. This tax grain was not stored locally. It was loaded onto these government barges and began its long, serpentine journey north. The arrival of the grain fleet at the capital's docks was a seasonal ritual of immense political significance. It meant the granaries would be filled, the soldiers paid in rations, the vast bureaucracy fed, and the city's markets supplied. This regular, predictable influx was the physical proof that the system worked, that the emperor's mandate held firm from the fertile paddies of the south to the arid plains of the north. More than just a supply line, the chaos created a bond of absolute dependency. The northern political elite, the scholars, the generals, the courtiers, all owed their full stomachs and their stability to the southern harvest. This made the southern gentry, the class that managed the local estates and collected the initial taxes, indispensable partners in the imperial project. Their wealth and status were now irrevocably tied to their role as suppliers to the throne. Any thought of southern separatism would mean severing their own access to prestige and power at the center. Conversely, the northern court had to govern the south with a careful hand, ensuring its productivity was never disrupted by excessive corruption or misrule, for to harm the south was to cut the capital's own lifeline. The canal, therefore, was more than an engineering feat. It was a geopolitical circuit, completing a loop of mutual need that physically bound the empire's richest region to its seat of power. The gentle current pushing those heavy barges northward was, in truth, the steady pulse of the dynasty's heart, a rhythm that had to be maintained at all costs to prevent the entire body from collapsing into famine and revolt. Yet even the most perfectly engineered system is only as strong as the human hands that guide it. The grand networks of roads, canals, and granaries were powerful tools for control, but they were never a magical shield against chaos. Their ultimate purpose was to serve a stable, functioning state. When that state began to falter, when corruption rotted the bureaucracy and the people lost faith, the very infrastructure built to ensure stability could be turned against the throne with devastating efficiency. This harsh lesson was written in blood and fire during the final, decaying decades of the Han Dynasty, a period when the system's failure became its own undoing. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, which erupted in the year 184, serves as the definitive case study. The rebellion's roots lay in a perfect storm of administrative collapse. At the local level, corrupt officials and powerful landowners were increasingly exploiting the peasantry, skewing the tax burden and seizing farms. In the capital, court eunuchs and rival factions paralyzed the central government with their intrigues. Meanwhile, a series of natural disasters, including floods along the Yellow River and widespread outbreaks of illness, created misery on a scale the state seemed incapable of addressing. The granaries, that crucial instrument of imperial benevolence, were often empty, mismanaged, or their reserves diverted by the very elites meant to administer them. When the state failed to fulfill its most basic duty to protect its people from hardship, the mandate of heaven appeared to be withdrawn. Into this vacuum of legitimacy stepped charismatic religious leaders like Zhang Ju, who promised healing, a new era of peace, and a direct spiritual challenge to the corrupt Han order. His followers, identifying themselves with yellow headbands, tapped into a deep, widespread desperation. What makes the Yellow Turban Rebellion so instructive for our story is not its religious fervor, but its logistical savvy. The rebels did not operate in a wilderness, they moved through the heart of the imperial system. They used the empire's own magnificent road network to coordinate their uprising across multiple provinces simultaneously, something impossible in an earlier, disconnected age. Messengers traveled the same highways as imperial couriers, carrying plans and rallying cries. More critically, the rebels understood the material sources of power. A key early tactic was the seizure of government granaries. By capturing these storehouses, they achieved two vital objectives. First, they fed their own growing armies, solving the immediate problem of supply that has crippled rebellions throughout history. Second, and more symbolically potent, they performed the ultimate act of political theater. They took the very resource meant to demonstrate the emperor's care for his people and redistributed it themselves, physically proving the state's failure and positioning themselves as the true providers. The imperial highways, built to speed armies to crush dissent, now carried the descent toward the capital. The Han response, while eventually militarily successful, was itself a confession of systemic failure. The court was forced to grant unprecedented military authority to regional governors and warlords to put down the rebellion, effectively decentralizing the very power the infrastructure was designed to centralize. Though the Yellow Turbans were defeated, the dynasty never recovered from this self-inflicted wound. The rebellion shattered the illusion of unshakable control. It revealed that infrastructure is not a substitute for good governance, it is its amplifier. A well-maintained road in a just state carries prosperity and order. A well-maintained road in a corrupt state carries rebellion just as fast. The granaries that could secure loyalty in a well-administered county could provision an army against the throne when that administration broke down. The late Han collapse presents the crucial qualification to our thesis. Stone and water can build the framework for stability, but only legitimacy, effective administration, and a concern for the people's welfare can fill that framework with lasting peace. The tools of empire are neutral, their power defined entirely by the hands that wield them. The empire's grand highways and canals created a map of movement, but true control was exercised at the points where that movement had to slow, to squeeze, to funnel through a narrow gate. Across the landscape, the state identified and fortified nature's own bottlenecks, the mountain passes where cliffs pinched the road, the shallow fords across wide rivers, and the massive gates piercing city walls. These were the choke points, the critical nodes where the abstract power of the empire became a tangible, daily encounter for every traveler, merchant, and farmer. A mountain pass was more than a convenient route through the peaks. It was a geopolitical valve. The Han would fortify these narrow defiles with watchtowers and garrison forts, placing a permanent military presence where geography forced all traffic into a single file. From these high perches, soldiers could observe for miles, counting caravans, identifying suspiciously large groups, and sending smoke signals to the next station down the line. For a merchant, this meant security from bandits, but it also meant a mandatory pause. At the pass, his goods would be inspected, his travel permits checked, and a transit tax levied based on the value of his cargo. This was how the state monetized geography itself, turning every natural gateway into a customs house. The efficiency was brutal. A rebel force hoping to move between provinces could not simply melt into the countryside. It had to confront these fortified barriers. A small, determined garrison holding a high pass could delay an army 10 times its size for weeks, buying the central government the precious time it needed to muster a response from the plains. These checkpoints fragmented the landscape of rebellion, ensuring that no internal threat could gain momentum without first announcing itself at a series of state-controlled gates. River crossings operated on the same principle. Instead of allowing boats to land anywhere along the bank, the state designated specific ferry points and built pontoon bridges at strategic locations. These became regulated portals, a farmer bringing his harvest to market, a family moving to a new province, a messenger on imperial business, all had to pass through these official channels. Here, officials could monitor population movement, looking for unusual migrations that might signal famine or unrest in a neighboring district. They could also control the spread of information or illness, isolating a region if necessary by simply closing the ferry or dismantling a bridge span. The city gate was the ultimate expression of this microcontrol. the point where the ordered world within met the uncertain world without. Each dawn, the massive wooden doors, reinforced with iron and guarded by watchful soldiers, would swing open with ceremonial slowness. Guards would check the credentials of those entering, especially after nightfall when the gates were sealed. This daily rhythm imposed a powerful psychological order. It defined who belonged inside the sphere of civilization and who was outside. It allowed the city authorities to track the comings and goings of strangers, to search for contraband like unauthorized weapons or seditious writings, and to maintain a curfew that prevented the cover of darkness from hiding conspiracy. The brilliance of this system was its layered integration. The mountain pass controlled movement between regions, the river crossing controlled movement within a region, and the city gate controlled movement at the very heart of community. Together, they created a graduated filter, screening the flow of people and goods at every scale. This network of choke points made the empire's vastness manageable. It transformed the challenge of governing millions across a continent into a simpler task of monitoring hundreds of critical doors. The official at the checkpoint, stamping a permit or collecting a tax, was the human face of this engineered stability, a reminder that in the empire of roads and rivers, you are always passing through someone's gate. The stone and earth of these projects were shaped by a less visible but equally vital structure, the law. Behind every mile of wall and every span of canal stood a dense framework of statutes and regulations, a bureaucratic architecture designed to ensure these monumental works were built to last and maintained for generations. This legal codification transformed infrastructure from a ruler's personal ambition into a permanent, self-perpetuating function of the state itself. Our clearest window into this administrative machinery comes from the Qin dynasty, thanks to the accidental preservation of thousands of inscribed bamboo slips discovered in a well in a remote tomb. These are not philosophical treatises but dry, meticulous government manuals, and they are revolutionary. They detail, with stunning specificity, the Qin legal code as it applied to public works. The statutes spell out the Corvée labor obligations with mathematical precision, defining exactly how many days of service each category of adult male owed the state per year and what constituted a valid exemption. They standardized the dimensions and materials for everything from the width of a cart axle to the proper method of ramming earth for a fortress wall. A road, according to these texts, was not simply a cleared path. It had a mandated width, a required crown for drainage, and specified trees planted at set intervals for marking and shade. This legal granularity meant an engineer sent to build a road in a newly conquered southern province and another sent to the northern frontier were working from the same exact blueprint, literally writing imperial uniformity into the landscape. But the laws went beyond construction. They enforced maintenance with a system of harsh accountability. Officials at the county and commandery level were legally responsible for the upkeep of the roads, bridges, and canals in their jurisdiction. The bamboo slips record the penalties for failure. A magistrate who allowed a crucial bridge to fall into disrepair, or who failed to mobilize laborers to clear silt from an irrigation channel before the spring floods, could face severe fines, demotion, or even corporal punishment. This created a powerful incentive for local administrators. Their personal fortune and career prospects were directly tied to the physical condition of the state's infrastructure. A well-maintained road was not just a civic good, it was proof of a competent, law-abiding official. This system ingeniously aligned local interests with central imperatives. The Qin and later Han states understood that a decree from the capital was meaningless if it evaporated upon reaching the provinces. By embedding infrastructure mandates into the penal code and tying them to bureaucratic performance reviews, they ensured that maintaining the empire's physical sinews became a core, inescapable duty of governance at every level. The grand projects were not temporary spectacles. They were legally mandated cycles of labor and upkeep, woven into the annual rhythm of administration. When a Han courier galloped down a straight road, he was riding not just on packed earth, but on a foundation of statutes, his speed a direct result of a local official's fear of the law's consequence. This was the ultimate sophistication, a state that had learned to build itself into its own laws, making the preservation of its physical form a permanent, self-reinforcing loop of legal obligation. The straight lines of imperial roads did not merely follow the lay of the land, they were often drawn to align with the heavens themselves. Beyond the practical needs of defense and commerce, the placement of walls, the orientation of cities, and the very direction of highways were frequently matters of profound cosmological significance. This was the ideological dimension of infrastructure, where engineering met astronomy and geomancy, the ancient practice of harmonizing human structures with the natural and celestial forces. For the emperor and his advisors, a road was not just a path for soldiers, it was a terrestrial reflection of a celestial pathway. The capital city, as we saw with Chang'an, was meticulously oriented to mirror the perceived order of the cosmos, with the palace in the north corresponding to the pole star. This was not mere symbolism, it was a statement of fundamental truth. By aligning his works with the stars and the flow of earthly energies, known as Kai, the emperor was demonstrating that his rule was not arbitrary, but a natural and necessary part of the universal design. He was, in essence, building the mandate of heaven directly into the landscape. This practice, which we might broadly associate with early forms of feng shui, provided a powerful tool for legitimization. When a massive conscription was ordered to build a new section of wall, the labor could be framed not as a tyrannical demand, but as a sacred duty to fortify the boundary between the civilized world and the chaotic void, a cosmic defense. When a canal was dug along a specific alignment, it could be presented as correcting the flow of vital energies to bring prosperity to the entire region, a benefit for all. This cosmological framing transformed public works from projects of political will into acts of cosmic maintenance. It offered a narrative that resonated deeply with both the educated elite, who understood the astrological correlations, and the common populace, who lived within a worldview where human fortune was tied to natural harmony. A farmer toiling on the wall might find a grim purpose in the belief that he was helping to uphold the very order of the world. This ideological layer served a crucial stabilizing function. It insulated the emperor from accusations of capriciousness or personal ambition. He was not building for his own glory alone. He was acting as the chief priest and engineer of the cosmos, fulfilling his celestial mandate to align the human realm with the divine. Disputes over the location or necessity of a project could be settled not by politics, but by court astronomers and geomancers interpreting omens and star charts. Their pronouncements carried the weight of objective, heavenly truth. Thus, the infrastructure that physically bound the empire also bound its people to a shared cosmological vision. The north-south axis of a highway, the cardinal orientation of a city gate, the specific summit chosen for a beacon tower, all whispered the same message, that the empire was a microcosm, a perfect, ordered reflection of the universe above. This belief made the stone and earth seem less like instruments of control and more like inherent features of a righteous world, a subtle but profound psychological reinforcement that the empire, in its very foundations, was meant to be. The empire's most effective walls were often the ones it tore down. While the first emperor is famous for building the Great Wall on the frontier, one of his most decisive acts of control was an aggressive campaign of demolition within the empire's very heart. Following the military conquest of the rival warring states, his administration issued a sweeping and ruthless order, the systematic destruction of the defensive walls, fortresses, and mountain strongholds that had belonged to the defeated kingdoms and their nobility. This was not an act of mere spite, but a surgical strike against the physical architecture of rebellion. For centuries, these local fortifications had been the ultimate symbols of regional power. A local lord ensconced behind his high walls with his own granaries and garrison could effectively ignore distant imperial edicts, levy his own taxes, and raise a private army. His fortress was a declaration of sovereignty in stone. By ordering these structures dismantled, the emperor was performing a profound act of political geography. He was erasing the old map of competing loyalties and drawing a new one where only two kinds of walls were permitted: the state's frontier barriers against external nomads, and the walls of state-approved administrative cities that housed imperial officials. This policy of internal disarmament forced a dramatic shift in the psychology of defense. A regional governor or wealthy magnate could no longer dream of retreating to a private citadel. His safety and the safety of the population under his care now depended entirely on the integrity of the imperial frontier and the swiftness of the imperial army traveling on the imperial roads. All defensive responsibility was deliberately centralized. If raiders breached the northern wall, it was the emperor's failure and the emperor's troops who would respond. This removed the very possibility of local warlords building independent power bases from which to challenge the center. The Han Dynasty, learning from the Qin precedent, rigorously continued this policy. They understood that the greatest threat to stability often came not from beyond the mountains, but from within the provinces. Any unauthorized construction of fortifications was treated as a grave crime, a direct challenge to the monopoly on violence held by the central state. This created a starkly clear internal landscape. The countryside was to be open, traversable, and productive, dotted with undefended villages and farms that relied on the state for protection. The only hardened points were the state's own administrative nodes, the county seats and commandery capitals, which were themselves laid out on open grids without the labyrinthine, defensible layouts of old feudal castles. This physical openness made control transparent. Imperial inspectors could ride through any region without facing barred gates or suspicious garrisons. Troop movements were instantly visible. The policy transformed the empire from a patchwork of potential mini-kingdoms into a unified, surveillable space. It was a foundational bargain, trading local autonomy for centralized security, and it ensured that the empire's formidable infrastructure always pointed outward. Its defensive energy focused on the horizon, never turned inward against itself. The silent, empty spaces where old fortresses once stood became the most powerful testament to imperial unity, a blank slate upon which only the emperor's roads and laws would be written. This state-centric vision of infrastructure stands in sharp relief when placed beside another ancient titan of engineering, Rome. While both empires built roads that stretched to the horizon, their fundamental purposes reveal a profound divergence in philosophy. The famed Roman roads, like the Appian Way, were arteries of commerce and cultural exchange, designed first to integrate a diverse empire of citizens and facilitate the movement of goods, troops, and ideas. Their network famously connected the vibrant, semi-autonomous cities around the Mediterranean, each with its own local governance and economic life. The road served to bind these distinct urban nodes into a shared Roman identity, but often left the vast countryside between them less directly controlled. In contrast, the early imperial Chinese road was, from its inception, an instrument of direct state command. Its straight-line imperative, its standardized ruts, and its integrated courier system were all designed for one overriding goal: to project the will of the central bureaucracy into every county and commandery, suppressing local variation and preempting dissent. The Chinese road did not merely connect points of existing power. It was the very thread that wove those points into a uniform tapestry dictated by the throne. A similar contrast emerges in their approach to water. Rome's magnificent aqueducts are testaments to urban engineering, masterpieces designed to deliver clean water to city baths, fountains, and the homes of the urban elite. They served the civic life and public health of concentrated population centers. China's monumental water projects, however, were engineered on an agrarian, continental scale. Systems like the Dujiangyan and the sprawling Grand Canal were not about urban luxury, but about macroeconomic control and the survival of the state itself. They were built to transform entire regions into reliable breadbaskets, to move tax grain across thousands of miles, and to prevent the peasant unrest that followed river floods. Where Rome's infrastructure often celebrated and served the city as the pinnacle of civilization, China's infrastructure was deliberately deployed to manage the countryside, the source of its wealth and its greatest potential instability. This comparison brings the Chinese model into crystalline focus. Its infrastructure was not a service for a pre-existing society. It was the primary tool for creating and maintaining that society in a specific, centralized form. Every stone laid and every canal dug was a conscious investment in a particular kind of stability, one where the state's reach was total, its priorities supreme, and its survival inextricably linked to its ability to reshape the very earth to its will. But a blueprint is useless if the builders cannot read it. The emperor's grand vision of roads and walls required a hidden, yet even more fundamental, layer of support, a common language for the empire itself. This was the soft infrastructure of standardization, the quiet revolution in script, measurement, and value that made every other physical project possible. Before a single stone could be laid for a frontier wall, the Qin state undertook a radical act of unification, one that targeted not the landscape, but the very tools of human communication and exchange. They imposed a single, uniform writing system, banning the varied scripts of the conquered states. They minted a universal bronze coin with a square hole in the center, outlawing the assortment of knife, spade, and shell money that had circulated before. And they decreed a single set of official weights and linear measures, sending standardized bronze models to every county magistrate. This may seem like administrative housekeeping, but it was, in fact, the neurological wiring for the imperial body. Without it, the physical infrastructure would have been a paralyzed giant. Consider the challenge of building that wall. An engineering specification sent from the capital to a foreman on the remote northern frontier had to be perfectly understood. The phrase for a unit of length, the character for the slope of an embankment, the numeral for the required volume of rammed earth, all had to be identical in both documents. A misunderstanding caused by a regional variant of a character could mean a weak point in the defenses, a fatal flaw born from a scribe's local habit. The uniform script eliminated this risk, creating a seamless flow of technical knowledge. The standardized weights and measures were the gears of the economic machine that funded everything. The land tax, the lifeblood of the state, was assessed as a share of the harvest. If every county used a different-sized bushel basket to measure grain, chaos would reign. A farmer in one region might owe twice as much actual grain as a farmer in another for the same sized plot, breeding instant resentment and making central financial planning impossible. The bronze standard measure sent to each governor meant that a dan of grain in the far south was exactly the same quantity as a dan in the capital's granary. This allowed for precise budgeting, fair assessment, and crucially, the trust that the system was impartial. It turned taxation from arbitrary plunder into a predictable and therefore tolerable obligation. Finally, the uniform coinage greased the wheels of the entire logistical network, paying the thousands of specialized workers, from toolmakers to scribes, who supported the conscript armies building the roads, required a reliable medium of exchange. Purchasing supplies from local markets near a construction site needed a currency everyone accepted. The round coin with a square hole became that universal token, facilitating the complex economy that swirled around every state project. It meant a carpenter from the eastern plains could sell his services on a western canal dig and be paid in money he knew would be good back home. This soft infrastructure dissolved the old economic borders just as the roads dissolved the political ones. Together, these standards created a realm of shared understanding. They were the operating system upon which the hardware of walls and canals could run. An order could be written in the capital, its meaning perfectly preserved across 1,000 miles, instructing a local official to mobilize a set number of men, paid from a treasury assessing taxes with a standard measure, to build a road of a specified width. The physical empire became coherent because the ideas behind it were first made identical. This invisible framework of shared rules and symbols was the true glue, binding the hard stones of ambition into a functioning and enduring whole. The soil carried by the Yellow River tells a story of unintended consequences. While the grand walls and canals secured the empire against human threats, they initiated a slower, more profound battle with the environment itself, one whose effects rippled across centuries. Each monumental project, in its pursuit of order, sent shockwaves through the natural systems it sought to harness. The most immediate impact was a wave of deforestation that swept from the northern frontiers to the southern mountains. To build a single mile of rammed earth wall required vast amounts of timber for scaffolding, for the frames that held the packed earth, and to fuel the kilns that produced bricks for later dynasties. The construction of imperial palaces and fleets of grain barges consumed entire forests. This stripping of the landscape had a cascading effect. Tree roots that once held soil in place on hillsides were gone, and with each heavy rain, erosion accelerated. This exposed soil, now loose and mobile, was washed into the very river systems the state depended on. The Yellow River, already heavy with loess from the central plains, grew even more choked with silt from deforested uplands. This increased siltation raised the riverbed, making it more prone to catastrophic flooding, the very disaster the water conservancy projects were meant to prevent. The empire's solution to one problem was in part creating another, more volatile one. The environmental cost was a hidden tax paid not in grain or labor, but in the increasing instability of the land itself. Furthermore, the sprawling canal networks, those marvels of hydraulic engineering, permanently rewrote regional hydrology. Diverting water for irrigation and transport on such a massive scale could starve some natural waterways and overburden others. In certain regions, historians note that the draw of water for state-managed agriculture may have lowered local water tables, affecting communities and ecosystems not directly served by the imperial system. The land was being remade to serve a political blueprint, and the natural world responded in complex, often unpredictable ways. This presents a crucial historical lesson, one that adds profound depth to our understanding of these ancient achievements. The relentless pursuit of political stability through environmental transformation did not eliminate risk, it often simply transferred it. It traded the immediate vulnerability to invasion and famine for a long-term vulnerability to ecological degradation and more severe natural disasters. A dynasty might feel secure behind its great wall, but if the fields that fed the garrison were slowly turning to dust or the river that supplied the capital was silting into a destructive force, that security was an illusion. The grand projects created a new kind of interdependence, where the empire's survival became ever more tightly linked to the maintenance of its own artificial landscape. This forced the state into a perpetual, exhausting cycle of repair and management, a fight against the entropy its own ambitions had unleashed. The cost-benefit analysis of imperial infrastructure must therefore account for this enduring legacy. The stones that unified China also reshaped its rivers and forests, setting in motion environmental challenges that would test the ingenuity of every dynasty that followed. It is a reminder that when we seek to control our world, the world always writes its own reply. The monumental walls and canals did not guarantee an eternal empire, but they did create a predictable rhythm to its rise and fall. This is the final, sobering pattern of the dynastic cycle, where infrastructure itself became both the engine of prosperity and the fuse for its own destruction. The cycle begins with a new dynasty born from the ashes of chaos. A vigorous ruler, having witnessed the failures of the past, understands that legitimacy is built with shovels and surveying tools. He launches a massive, state-directed campaign of public works, repairing the ruined canals to revive agriculture, clearing the overgrown roads to reassert control, and reinforcing the frontier walls to secure the realm. This initial investment is staggering, paid for by the blood and sweat of a conscripted populace, but it yields an undeniable return. The repaired irrigation systems lead to bumper harvests, filling the state granaries and the treasury. The secure roads allow trade to flourish, bringing wealth and exotic goods to the capital. For decades, sometimes a century, this virtuous cycle spins, creating a golden age of stability, population growth, and cultural achievement. The empire feels solid, permanent, a perfect machine humming along the tracks its founders laid. Yet within that very success lie the seeds of the next crisis. The very abundance created by the infrastructure encourages a dangerous sense of complacency at the top. As generations pass, the imperial court grows distant from the gritty reality of maintenance. The founding emperor's urgent focus on pragmatic engineering gives way to his successor's interest in grander, more prestigious projects, or simply the luxuries the system now affords. The bureaucracy, once lean and focused, becomes bloated. Funds earmarked for the essential, unglamorous work of dredging silt from a canal or repacking the eroded face of a wall are quietly diverted. They might be siphoned off by corrupt local officials to build private mansions or redirected to the capital for lavish court festivals. This is the phase of quiet decay, where the physical sinews of the state begin to fray out of sight. A minor official in a remote province, fearing punishment for a problem he did not create, might simply stop filing reports on the crumbling dike. The neglect is incremental, almost invisible from the palace, but it accumulates with geological force. Then comes the triggering event, often a natural one that the weakened system can no longer absorb. The neglected dike, its foundations softened by years of unrepaired leaks, finally gives way during the spring floods. The river, heavy with the silt from deforested hillsides, surges across the now unprotected farmland. The local granaries, poorly managed or half-empty due to earlier corruption, cannot feed the suddenly starving population. At the same time, on the frontier, a section of the wall that has not been properly patrolled in years offers an easy passage for raiders who sweep in to plunder the already distressed region. The state's response is slow and clumsy, its communication networks clogged by inefficiency, its troops delayed by roads now pitted with unrepaired ruts. In the devastated countryside, a desperate populace, seeing the state fail in its most basic duty to provide security and food, has nothing left to lose. A charismatic rebel leader rises, promising order and sustenance. His followers, armed with little more than farming tools, seize the very symbol of the state's failure, a neglected granary, and use its contents to feed their growing rebellion. The roads built for imperial control now speed the rebel army toward the capital. The dynasty, rotted from within by the decay of its own physical foundations, topples in a final, violent spasm. And then the cycle resets. From the chaos emerges a new strongman, a general or provincial governor who has seen the catastrophe firsthand. He gazes upon the silted canals, the collapsed bridges, and the breached walls, and he understands the lesson with perfect clarity. Stability is not a gift but a construct. His first act upon declaring a new dynasty will be to call for the census rolls and the engineering manuals. He will mobilize a new generation of conscripts, point them toward the ruins, and begin the arduous work of rebuilding. He is not inventing a new system, he is resurrecting the old one, hoping to master the same tools that doomed his predecessor. In this relentless rhythm, infrastructure is revealed as the ultimate dynamic force, a living entity that must be constantly fed with resources, attention, and integrity. It offers not a permanent solution, but a temporary lease on order, one that must be renewed by each generation or else be forfeited entirely. The Great Walls stand not only against external enemies, but as silent monitors of the empire's own internal vitality, their endurance a daily test of the state's will to maintain the world it has built. Centuries after the Han collapse, the old imperial model found its most breathtaking and brutal expression. In the late 6th century, the short-lived but immensely ambitious Sui dynasty seized power, ending centuries of division. The Sui emperors looked upon a fractured China and saw not just a political problem but a geographical one. The economic heart of the nation now beat firmly in the fertile, rice-rich Yangtze River basin in the south, while the tradition of political and military power remained anchored in the drier northern plains. These were two different worlds, one of waterways and paddies, the other of dust and cavalry. The old Han canals were insufficient, and overland transport was a costly, slow bottleneck. The Sui solution was a project of staggering audacity, one that would consume the dynasty's entire lifespan and treasury, the Grand Canal. This was not merely a new waterway, it was a complete artificial river system, linking the Yellow River in the north to the Yangtze in the south, and stretching over 1,100 miles. It was the early imperial strategy writ in water on a continental scale, the ultimate tool for binding disparate zones into a single, inseparable organism. The human cost was almost beyond comprehension. Millions of conscripted laborers, including women and children, were mobilized from a population still recovering from war. Historical records speak of immense hardship, with workers toiling under harsh conditions, and the project casting a long shadow over the Sui's brief reign. Yet, from the perspective of pure statecraft, the engineering logic was flawless. The Grand Canal solved the fundamental logistical equation forever. It created a permanent, high-capacity pipeline for the South's agricultural wealth to flow directly to the northern capitals of Luoyang and Chang'an. A fleet of government barges could now move thousands of tons of tax grain with a reliability and speed that caravans of ox carts could never match. This did more than feed the northern elites, it made them utterly dependent on southern productivity. Simultaneously, it gave the southern gentry a direct, vested interest in the stability of the northern court, as their prosperity was now hitched to the imperial system that purchased their surplus. The canal physically stitched the two halves of China together, making the idea of a separate southern kingdom a logistical absurdity. It turned the geographical diversity that had once fostered division into a source of complementary strength. The Sui dynasty itself, exhausted by the effort, fell quickly to rebellion, a victim of the very model it pushed to its extreme. But it left behind a gift that would define the next golden age. The Grand Canal was the perfected instrument of control, the culmination of centuries of infrastructural thinking. It set the stage for the magnificent Tang dynasty that followed, providing the economic bedrock for its cosmopolitan flourishing. The Tang did not need to invent a new system of unity, they simply inherited the perfect tool, a silent aquatic highway that guaranteed the North would never starve and the South would never secede. In that endless flow of water and grain, the ancient dream of a unified, stable empire finally found its most enduring current. The silent stones themselves hold the proof of this grand ambition. While chronicles and poems tell the story, it is the spade and the satellite that reveal the true scale of ancient engineering. modern archaeology has unearthed the physical bones of these imperial systems, transforming legend into measurable fact. Across the arid plains of Shaanxi province, the ghost of a Qin highway still etches the earth. Archaeologists have traced long, straight stretches of what they call the Qin Strait Road, its foundation layer of rammed earth still visible as a subtle, raised causeway cutting across the landscape. The precision is startling even after 2 millennia. The roadbed, built with a sophisticated technique of tamping layers of earth and gravel between wooden forms, remains compact and resistant to erosion. In some sections, researchers have even found the parallel ruts worn into the surface by countless standardized carts, a silent testament to the relentless traffic that once flowed along this imperial artery. These are not mere paths, they are fossilized vectors of control, their unwavering lines proving that the first emperor's decrees were not empty boasts, but commands literally carved into the continent. Far to the west, in the desolate dunes of the Taklamakan Desert, a different kind of sentinel stands watch. Here, the Han Dynasty's frontier outposts have been preserved by the very aridity that once threatened them. Mud brick watchtowers, some still several stories tall, rise from the sands like broken teeth. These were not part of a continuous wall, but a network of signal stations stretching along the Silk Road. From their heights, guards could spot the dust of approaching caravans or raiding parties and send messages via smoke by day or fire by night, relaying information hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. Excavations at these sites have yielded fragments of life on the edge, broken pottery, discarded arrowheads, and even ancient ration records written on wood. They tell a story of lonely vigilance, of soldiers stationed at the very limit of the world, their survival and their purpose entirely dependent on the logistical web that connected them back to the heart of the empire. Perhaps the most intimate window into the bureaucratic machine comes from a waterlogged pit in Hunan province. In a remote well, archaeologists discovered a cache of over 36,000 inscribed bamboo slips from the Qin dynasty. These were not royal edicts but the mundane paperwork of local administration, a treasure trove of legal statutes, population registers, and grain reports. One slip might detail the punishment for a county official who fails to repair a bridge on time. Another records the exact amount of grain paid as tax by a specific farmer. Yet another outlines the rations for conscripted laborers building a road. These slips are the empire's central nervous system captured in mid-impulse. They reveal a state obsessed with data, accountability, and standardized procedure. They prove that the grand vision of unified infrastructure was supported by an equally impressive and relentless system of daily management. The emperor's power flowed not just through canals but through these endless streams of documentation. The course of history's greatest waterways is now traced from the air. The Lingqu Canal and the early sections of what would become the Grand Canal are no longer mysteries. Using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, researchers have mapped their original routes with stunning accuracy. They can see how Qin engineers at the link cleverly used a series of gentle, winding channels to navigate the subtle watershed, a design that minimized erosion and maximized flow. They have identified the remains of ancient splitter dams and lock gates, technologies that allowed boats to traverse changes in water level. This physical evidence confirms the historical accounts of their brilliance, showing that these were not crude ditches, but sophisticated hydraulic systems designed for permanence. Even where the canals have silted up or been rebuilt, their original paths reveal the strategic logic of their planners, connecting key population centers and resource zones in the most efficient way possible. Each discovery adds another layer to our understanding, proving that the stability of early China was not a historical accident, but the deliberate product of minds that thought in continents and centuries, their plans still legible in the very shape of the land. The true power of a wall is not measured only by the arrows it stops, but by the thoughts it plants in the mind. Beyond their practical functions, the monumental projects of early China were masterfully designed psychological instruments, their sheer, overwhelming scale engineered to communicate a single, unshakable truth. The state was not merely present, it was omnipotent, eternal, and watching. This was control through spectacle, a deliberate theater of power performed in stone and earth. Imagine standing at the base of the Great Wall as it crests a distant mountain ridge, a man-made line defying the natural chaos of the peaks. For a farmer from the Central Plains, this sight was not just a defense, it was a profound shock to the senses. It declared that the emperor's will could reshape the very bones of the world, bending geography itself to his command. The psychological message was one of sublime intimidation mixed with pride. If the state could accomplish this, what rebellion could possibly hope to succeed? The wall was a permanent, silent sermon on the futility of resistance. Similarly, the experience of traveling an imperial straight road delivered its own psychological conditioning. Walking or riding along that unnervingly perfect line, with its unbroken perspective vanishing into the horizon, created a feeling of being channeled, guided inexorably toward a destination chosen by the state. There were no choices, no alternative paths branching off into ambiguity. The road itself, through its rigid geometry, imposed a mental discipline of conformity and direction. It made the empire feel orderly, predictable, and utterly in control of the space you moved through. For a visiting tribal envoy from the steppes, the sight of such a road spearheading into the distance, flanked by watchtowers and maintained by an endless supply of labor, sent a clear diplomatic signal. It spoke of a civilization with resources so vast and an organizational capacity so deep that contesting it was not just dangerous but irrational. The spectacle communicated inexhaustible strength, hoping to deter conflict through a display of latent potential. Even the capital city, with its symmetrical grid and towering palace gates, was a daily psychological exercise for its inhabitants. To live within those perfect right angles was to internalize the empire's love of order. The grand avenues leading directly to the emperor's residence made his presence the literal and figurative center of the universe. This architectural propaganda surrounded people constantly, normalizing the hierarchy and making the central authority feel as natural and immutable as the sunrise. The infrastructure, therefore, worked on two psychological levels simultaneously. For the internal populace, it fostered a mix of awe, dependence, and a sense of shared identity under a powerful protector. For external rivals, it projected an image of invulnerability and relentless capacity, making the cost of confrontation seem forbiddingly high. These stones and roads were more than tools. They were the physical vocabulary of dominance, a language everyone, regardless of their own tongue, could understand. The most enduring walls are often the ones built not just on hilltops, but in the imagination of those who behold them. But stone and law are inert without the minds to animate them. The true operators of the imperial machine were not the laborers who moved earth, but the men who moved the ledgers. A new class of administrator rose to prominence under the Han, one that would define Chinese governance for 2,000 years, the Confucian educated scholar official, or literati. These were not hereditary nobles with private armies, nor were they wealthy merchants. They were individuals who had painstakingly memorized the classical texts, who wrote elegant poetry, and who had internalized a philosophy that prized social harmony, ritual propriety, and loyal service to a righteous ruler. Their power came not from a sword but from a brush, and it was this brush that became the essential tool for managing the empire's colossal physical ambitions. The literati bureaucrat was the vital synapse connecting the emperor's grand vision to the muddy reality of a construction site. His duties were breathtaking in their scope. When a new canal was proposed, it was his task to calculate the budget, not in vague terms, but in precise numbers of laborers, days of food, tons of grain, and quantities of timber. He had to survey the proposed route, considering not just engineering efficiency, but its impact on existing farmland and villages. He drafted the memorials to the throne, arguing for the project's necessity with references to ancient sage kings and the welfare of the people. Once approved, he became the project's chief executive. He organized the conscription of workers from nearby counties, ensuring the quotas were met without completely stripping a region of its farming manpower. He managed the supply chains, arranging for grain shipments from state granaries to feed the workforce and for tools to be delivered from imperial workshops. He kept the meticulous records demanded by law, accounting for every bushel of rice consumed and every foot of earth moved. His presence turned chaotic human effort into a coordinated, state-directed enterprise. This system created a profound and symbiotic relationship. The state, embodied by the emperor, provided the literati with something priceless: legitimacy and purpose. By passing the rigorous imperial examinations and receiving an official post, a scholar gained immense social prestige and a direct role in shaping the world according to Confucian ideals of benevolent order. He was not just building a wall, he was fortifying civilization itself. In return, the literati class gave the state its operational brain. They provided the administrative continuity that outlasted any single emperor. Their shared education in a common canon of texts created a unified bureaucratic culture across the vast empire. A magistrate in the far south and a comptroller in the northern capital spoke the same administrative language, followed the same procedural codes, and upheld the same ideals of service. This created a ruling coalition far more stable than one based on fear or military force alone. The emperor held the mandate of heaven, but the literati held the knowledge of how to make that mandate function on earth. They had a vested interest in the success of the state's projects, for their own status and influence grew with the empire's stability and wealth. A well-managed canal that increased harvests was a line on their performance review, a step toward promotion. This alignment of interests cemented their loyalty. They became the permanent managerial class, the guardians of the system's memory. They knew why a particular dike had been built a certain way generations ago, and they documented the lessons from every flood and every famine. Their collective expertise, archived in mountains of paperwork, became the empire's institutional knowledge, allowing each new dynasty to learn from the triumphs and mistakes of the past. So while we remember the emperors who ordered the walls, we should also remember the unknown officials in dusty offices, their robes stained with ink, who calculated the cost, drafted the work schedules, and quietly, competently willed the stones into place. They were the human software that made the hardware of empire function, proving that the most enduring infrastructure of all is often a well-trained mind. Even the most impressive ruins leave room for argument. For all the evidence we have of these ancient projects, they remain shrouded in historical debate, their true purpose and effectiveness still hotly contested by scholars today. This is not a sign of failure, but a testament to their complexity. The stones may be silent, but the questions they provoke are very much alive. Take the Great Wall, that iconic symbol of defense. A traditional view paints it as a purely defensive barrier, a static shield against nomadic invasion. Yet a growing number of historians argue for a more nuanced and perhaps more aggressive purpose. They point out that the early walls, especially under the Qin and Han, were often built forward, projecting into contested territory. These were not just walls to hide behind, but fortified supply lines and springboards for campaigns. The wall allowed the empire to secure a corridor, stockpile troops and grain far from the heartland, and launch controlled expeditions into the steppe. In this reading, the wall was as much an instrument of offense as defense, a tool for managing and expanding the frontier rather than merely sealing it off. The debate forces us to reconsider a basic assumption. Were these emperors building a fence, or were they laying down railroad tracks for conquest? The answer likely shifts with each dynasty and each emperor's ambition, revealing the wall not as a single idea, but as an evolving strategy in stone. Equally contentious is the actual performance of the state's most benevolent tool, the emergency granary system. The historical records are full of edicts praising their use and officials lauding their life-saving role. But how reliable were they in a true, widespread catastrophe? Skeptical scholars dig into local records and find a more patchy reality. While the system worked well for localized droughts or floods, a nationwide crisis could overwhelm it completely. The logistics of moving grain from a surplus region to a starving one were immense, and corruption was a constant threat. A corrupt local magistrate might sell off the reserve for personal profit, or a powerful landowner might pressure officials to divert grain to his own clients. There are accounts from the late Han period of granaries standing empty while famine raged outside their gates. This raises a critical question: was the granary network a genuine safety net for the people, or was it primarily a political symbol, a prop used to demonstrate the emperor's virtue whether it functioned perfectly or not? The truth probably lies in the difficult middle, a system designed with idealistic intent but forever at war with human fallibility and logistical limits. Its power to secure loyalty depended entirely on it being full and fairly administered, the very conditions that often broke down when they were needed most. Perhaps the deepest debate of all strikes at the heart of our entire story. Did infrastructure cause China's unification, or did it merely consolidate a victory already won by the sword? It is a classic chicken and egg puzzle of history. One school of thought argues that the Qin's military conquest came first, a decade of brutal warfare that physically subdued the rival states. Only after the battlefield was quiet could the first emperor launch his projects of standardization and construction. In this view, the roads and walls were tools of occupation, the means by which a military dictatorship made its victory permanent. They consolidated control but did not create the initial unity. The opposing perspective, however, suggests the tools of unity were being forged long before the final war. The Qin's mastery of hydraulic engineering with projects like the Dujiangyan gave it the economic surplus to fund larger armies. Its early experiments in centralized bureaucracy provided the administrative template. The rival states' own infrastructure projects created the technical knowledge and labor practices that the Qin would later scale up. From this angle, the Warring States period was a centuries-long competition in state building, and the Qin simply proved to be the most efficient model. Its final military triumph was less the cause of unity, and more the final exam after a long course of study in how to run an empire. The unification, therefore, was not an event but a process, and infrastructure was not the reward at the end, but the very curriculum studied along the way. These unresolved questions do not undermine the narrative, they enrich it. They remind us that history is not a solved equation, but an ongoing conversation. The silent walls and empty canals are not just relics, they are prompts. They ask us to look closer, to think critically about motive and effect, and to see the ancient engineers and emperors not as flawless giants, but as brilliant, ambitious, and deeply human problem solvers, grappling with challenges of scale and control that feel remarkably familiar even today. For an emperor surveying his new realm, the decision to launch a monumental canal or a 1,000-mile wall was not an act of vanity, but a cold, strategic calculation. It was the ultimate investment proposal, weighed not in silver but in the currency of human labor and future stability. The short-term costs were staggering and brutally clear. The treasury would hemorrhage funds to feed and equip armies of conscripts. The fields would lose millions of man-days of agricultural labor, potentially risking local harvests. And the human hardship inflicted upon those drafted into service was immense, a social debt that could fuel resentment for generations. From a purely economic standpoint, the initial outlay appeared ruinous. Yet, from the throne, the long-term balance sheet told a completely different story. The emperor and his advisors were not planning for a single fiscal year. They were building an endowment for a dynasty intended to last 10,000 generations. Every project was evaluated through this lens of perpetual return. A secure northern frontier wall meant the empire could maintain a smaller, less expensive standing army in the interior, freeing up resources. More critically, it prevented the catastrophic economic collapse that followed a major nomadic breach, which could devastate entire provinces, erase tax bases, and cost far more in emergency military campaigns than the wall ever did. The wall was an insurance policy with a very high premium, but against the risk of total societal ruin, it made financial sense. The calculus for roads and canals was even more direct. The imperial highway network, for all its cost, generated a continuous stream of revenue. By making commerce safe, predictable, and taxable, the roads themselves became income generators. They lowered the cost of moving troops to quell unrest, making rebellion a less attractive gamble for regional rivals. They enabled the efficient collection of the land tax, the state's primary income, ensuring more grain actually reached the central granaries instead of being lost to spoilage or local corruption on slow, dangerous paths. A canal like the Grand Canal transformed the state's finances from a precarious, local operation into an integrated, continental system. The cost of building it was a one-time capital expenditure, but the return was a perpetual, reliable flow of tax grain, the lifeblood of the imperial court and military. This grain fed the bureaucracy, paid the soldiers, and stabilized prices in the capital, preventing the urban unrest that could topple a government. The infrastructure locked the most productive regions into a dependent relationship with the political center, ensuring their wealth continually recycled back to fund the state that protected them. For founding emperors like Qin Shi Huang and Han Wudi, this analysis was not a difficult one. They had risen to power in an era of fragmentation and brutal warfare. They had seen firsthand the astronomical cost of chaos, the collapse of trade, the famine from disrupted agriculture, and the endless drain of treasure into cyclical civil wars. From that perspective, the massive, upfront investment in infrastructure was a bargain. It was the cost of buying out the competition for good, of purchasing a monopoly on violence and logistics across the entire known world. They were not spending, they were investing in a system designed to make spending on future wars unnecessary. The roads, walls, and canals were the physical shares they purchased in the company of empire, expecting them to pay dividends in peace, prosperity, and dynastic longevity for centuries to come. The human toll was a line item in a ledger they believed was justified by the alternative, a return to the endless, expensive bloodshed of the past. In their eyes, they were not consuming their people's labor, they were converting it into the permanent assets of a stable civilization. The blueprint for imperial control was never a single, rigid document. It was a principle, a core idea of state power that proved astonishingly adaptable to the wild diversity of the Chinese landscape. The genius of the system lay not in imposing uniformity upon nature, but in reading the land itself as a strategic text, then applying the appropriate engineering vocabulary to each chapter. In the arid, wind-scoured north, the primary threat was mobility, the sudden, sweeping cavalry raids of steppe confederations. Here, the land dictated the solution, a sprawling, linear fortification. Building the Great Wall across those barren mountains and deserts was a logical response to an open geography, creating a controlled channel where before there had been only empty space. The wall turned a vague, undefendable frontier into a series of manageable gates and watchtowers, a response written in rammed earth to the challenge of the plains. Yet travel 1,000 miles south to the humid, river-laced basins of the Yangtze and Pearl River deltas, and the same imperial principle found expression in a completely different medium, water. Here, the threat was not open invasion, but isolation and the potential for a separate, water-based economy to develop. The land was already crisscrossed with natural highways, but they did not all lead to the capital. The imperial response was to dig, to redirect, to connect. Grand canals like the Lingqu and the later Sui-Tang systems were the southern equivalent of the northern wall, but instead of blocking movement, they captured and directed it. They physically stitched the watery south to the political north, ensuring that the region's wealth flowed along state-approved channels. The principle of control remained identical, but the tool was chosen by the terrain: stone for the steppe, water for the paddies. This adaptability extended to the empire's mountainous western frontiers. Here, the challenge was not vast plains or river networks, but extreme verticality, where towering ranges like the Qinling and Hengduan created natural fortresses. An army could not march through solid rock, and a wall across every peak was impossible. Instead, the state focused on the gaps, the few precious passes where a trail could be carved. These became the ultimate choke points. The empire fortified these narrow defiles with towering gatehouses and garrison forts, places like the legendary Hanggu Pass or the Jade Gate out in the western deserts. Controlling a single mountain pass meant controlling all movement between two major valleys or basins. A small, determined garrison could hold off an army indefinitely, making these sites the linchpins of Western defense. The strategy was one of selective fortification, pinning the empire's control to the few points where geography forced everyone to slow down and queue up. Finally, look to the southeastern coast, a region of deep harbors, monsoons, and maritime trade. Here, the traditional tools of walls and canals were of limited use against a threat that could arrive from any point on the horizon. The imperial model adapted once more. While never developing a standing navy of the scale seen in later European empires, the Han and later dynasties established coastal commanderies and built fortified naval bases at key ports. They sought to regulate and tax the thriving sea trade with Southeast Asia, and to suppress the piracy that could destabilize coastal communities. The infrastructure of control here was a combination of sheltered harbors for official ships, signal towers along the coast to warn of approaching vessels, and administrative centers that monitored merchant activity. It was a more diffuse, network-based approach suited to an open, aquatic frontier. This geographical flexibility reveals the true sophistication of the imperial mind. It was not about forcing the land to conform to a preconceived plan, but about discerning the land's own logic of power and then reinforcing it with state engineering. Whether the answer was a wall, a canal, a mountain fortress, or a naval station, the question was always the same: how do we make this place legible, manageable, and irrevocably part of the whole? The empire's stability was built not on one type of stone, but on a deep, strategic conversation with the earth itself. The legacy of those ancient roads and canals extends far beyond their crumbling stones. They offer us a fundamental lesson in the anatomy of state power, a lesson that resonates across centuries and continents. The early Chinese empires demonstrate with breathtaking clarity that durable authority is never sustained by ideology or military might alone. True, lasting control is built upon the physical systems that make that ideology tangible and that military might deployable. Infrastructure is not merely a reflection of power, it is power's primary language, its grammar written in earth and water. Think of a state as a living organism. Its ideas are the genetic code, the blueprint for what it wants to be. Its armies are the immune system, the reactive force against external threats. But infrastructure is the circulatory and nervous systems combined. Without roads and canals, the economic lifeblood cannot flow to nourish the whole body. Without courier networks and signal towers, the central brain cannot sense a fever in a distant limb or send commands to heal it. A state with grand ideas but broken roads is a mind trapped in a paralyzed body. A state with a fierce army but empty granaries is an immune system that will soon consume its own host. The Qin and Han dynasties understood this biological imperative. They invested in the sinews and nerves first, knowing that a body with strong, responsive systems could endure internal sickness and external blows that would shatter a more brittle form. This is why we study their walls and waterways not just as engineering feats, but as political texts. Each project was a sentence in a long argument for unity, a physical promise of security, prosperity, and order. When a farmer in a remote village saw a straight, well-maintained road appear, he was receiving a direct message from the capital. It said, "You are connected. Your surplus has a path to market, our soldiers have a path to protect you, and our laws have a path to reach you." The road made the abstract idea of belonging to an empire a daily, practical reality. Similarly, the granary in the county seat was a silent but potent symbol. It transformed the emperor's theoretical mandate to care for the people into a tangible storehouse of grain, a reserve against despair. This physical manifestation of benevolence was far more convincing than any proclamation. It created a covenant of dependency and loyalty that was renewed with every harvest and every distribution. The state earned its legitimacy not through words but through works. This lesson reframes how we understand governance itself. It suggests that the most critical political debates are often not about which philosophy is superior, but about which bridges get built, which ports get dredged, and which regions are wired into the national grid. These are the decisions that physically determine who is included, who prospers, and who is left behind. They shape the lived experience of citizenship more directly than any party manifesto. When we look at our own modern world, we see the same principles at play, albeit with different tools. High-speed rail networks, fiber optic internet backbones, and satellite navigation systems are the straight roads and imperial posts of our age. They centralize information, accelerate economic integration, and enable a new kind of logistical control. A nation's digital infrastructure today is as vital to its sovereignty and stability as the Great Wall was to the Han. The ancient Chinese case provides a timeless analytical lens, reminding us that to truly grasp the nature of any state, at any point in history, we must look down at what it has built into the earth and follow those lines to see where the power truly flows. The most enduring empires are those that learn to write their laws in the landscape itself. The silent stones and faded waterways of early China hold a final, undeniable truth. The Qin and Han dynasties did not merely conquer territory, they engineered a civilization. Their lasting stability was not a gift of fate, but a deliberate construction project, translated into reality through the tangible instruments of roads, walls, canals, and granaries. This was a multifaceted strategy of breathtaking scope. Military mobility was guaranteed by the straight roads and signal towers, shrinking the empire and making rebellion a logistical impossibility. Economic integration was forced by the grand canals and standardized trade routes, locking the wealth of distant regions into a circulatory system that fed the capital. Ideological spectacle was performed in the overwhelming scale of the Great Wall and the perfect grid of the capital city, broadcasting a message of eternal, unassailable power directly into the mind of every subject. And underpinning it all was the relentless machinery of bureaucratic control, the legal codes and scribble records that turned monumental ambition into daily, manageable administration. This was not a series of isolated projects, but a single, coherent operating system for empire. The legacy of this model is written across 2,000 years of Chinese history. Every subsequent dynasty, from the Tang to the Ming to the Qing, inherited this fundamental playbook. They understood that to rule the Middle Kingdom was to engage in a perpetual conversation with the land itself, using engineering to dictate the terms of unity, prosperity, and defense. This ancient formula defined the very essence of imperial governance, proving that the most enduring political orders are those that build their principles directly into the earth. So the next time you see a map, consider the lines drawn upon it not just as borders, but as arguments. The straight road, the fortified wall, the connecting canal, each is a statement about how power believes the world should be organized. The story of early China's infrastructure is ultimately a story about the perennial relationship between engineering and political order, a reminder that the shape of our landscapes is forever shaped by the ambitions of those who seek to hold them. What other historical mysteries about the foundations of power would you like to explore? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to follow for more journeys into the deep past.